Yellowstone is one of those places that I had always wanted to go, but somehow never actually managed to go. I know that sounds strange for someone who grew up in Wyoming, but growing up in Casper means Yellowstone is about 4 hours north, and 4 hours when you're a kid feels like a different country, the kind of distance that requires the alignment of parental enthusiasm and available weekends and sufficient planning. And in my family, those three things never quite converged at the same time. My dad was more of a fish in the creek behind the house person, content to drive 20 minutes rather than 4 hours for the outdoor experience, and my mom worked most weekends through most of my childhood because she was building the kind of career that doesn't observe the conventional work week when you're in the middle of building it. Yellowstone stayed on the list of things I was going to do someday in the way that a lot of things stay on that list present enough to feel like an intention, not urgent enough to become an action. I finally went at 23 years old, which is not a remarkable age for a first national park visit, but which felt significant to me given how long the wanting had been sitting around waiting to become doing. I went with four of my friends, which is how I do most things worth doing. My name is Jordan Kelsey, and I want to tell you what happened on that trip, because I think about it nearly every day. And I have told the complete story to exactly two people, my sister Becca, who is the person I tell things to when I need someone to believe me, before I know whether what I'm saying deserves to be believed, and my therapist, Dr. Watkins, who listened to the whole account across 3 sessions in the careful way of someone who is professionally trained not to express disbelief, and who I think, if I'm honest, believed more than the professional training allowed her to show. The friends were Priya Sharma, Marcus Webb, Claire Donahue, and Danny Riggs. Priya I have known since sophomore year of college, when we lived on the same floor of the same dormitory in Laramie, and discovered we both kept the same odd hours and had the same specific feelings about the cafeteria's Thursday pasta situation, which was the kind of shared grievance that forms friendships faster than shared interests do. Priya is from Houston originally, but has lived in Wyoming long enough to develop strong opinions about it, which is the threshold I use for whether someone has genuinely adapted to a place versus just living in it. She works in environmental consulting now and is the most organized person I know, and also someone who genuinely cares about the natural world in a way that informs her work without being precious about it. Marcus went to the same college as Priya and me a year ahead of us, and is one of those people who is friends with everyone without appearing to try at it. The kind of person who ends up in the photographs at every social event without having planned to be there. He is genuinely funny in the way that requires a specific intelligence, not the kind of funny that relies on volume or repetition. And he is also the kind of person who does not take warnings seriously, and who finds in other people's caution something slightly comic, which is a personality trait I have examined much more closely since August of last year than I ever had before. Claire Donahue was Marcus's girlfriend at the time, 8 months in, still in the phase of the relationship where she found his approach to caution charming rather than exhausting. She was studying landscape architecture and was the most visually attentive person in our group, the one who noticed composition and light in ways the rest of us didn't, and who took photographs that looked intentional rather than documentary. Danny Riggs was my boyfriend a year and a half in at the time of the trip, and I want to tell you about Danny carefully because he matters to this story more than anyone else, and because I want to be accurate about who he was then and who he is now, and what the distance between those two things cost both of us. Danny is not a dramatic person. He is not someone who performs emotions or amplifies situations for effect. He is the person you want next to you in something difficult, because he stays steady in a way that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with temperament. A genuine equilibrium that I found extremely attractive, and that I still find attractive, and that in the weeks and months following the trip, I watched work very hard to contain something it was not designed to contain. He grew up outside of Rock Springs, which is about as Wyoming as you can get without being a geological feature, and he has the particular quality of Wyoming-raised men who are not interested in proving anything to anyone and who are therefore paradoxically capable of quite a lot. We planned the trip for a long weekend in late August. We had been planning it since April and had argued about every aspect of it with the specific productive arguing of a friend group that has known each other long enough to argue without it being a problem about where to camp, whether to do backcountry or car camping, how many days, which section of the park, what to pack, and who was responsible for what. The argument about location went on for 6 weeks, which sounds like too long for a decision that most people make in an afternoon. But we were all invested in it being right, and we had different ideas about what right meant. We landed on the Bechler River area in the southwestern corner of the park, which was Priya's recommendation. She had read that it was significantly less crowded than the main geyser areas, that it had exceptional wildlife viewing, particularly in late summer, and that the thermal features in the Bechler section of the park were less dramatic than Old Faithful but more interesting in a geological sense, which is exactly the kind of distinction Priya makes, and that the rest of us accept because she is usually right about these things. We had reservations at a backcountry campsite about 6 miles in from the Bechler River trailhead. We had bare canisters and proper permits, and the right boots and the right layers for high-altitude, late-summer Wyoming nights. I had read the park's backcountry guidelines and knew the regulations about thermal features and wildlife distances and leave-no-trace protocols. I want to be clear about this because it matters to how I understand what happened. We were not unprepared people who went into a wilderness area without thinking about it. We prepared. We just did not prepare for the specific thing that happened, because the specific thing that happened is not in the backcountry guidelines. We drove up on a Friday morning and reached the Bechler trailhead around 1 in the afternoon. The parking area had 3 other vehicles when we arrived, 2 of which appeared to belong to a family group we saw setting up car camping at the nearby campground rather than heading into the backcountry, and one of which was a dusty Forest Service truck with no one near it. The relative emptiness of the trailhead was part of the appeal of the Bechler. The main geyser areas see thousands of visitors on a summer day, and the Bechler in the same period sees dozens. We were after the version of the park that doesn't require waiting in line. The hike in was 6 miles of mostly flat terrain, which took us about 3 hours, given the weight of our packs and our tendency to stop every time the light did something interesting or an animal appeared at a distance. The Beckler area is not what most people picture when they picture Yellowstone. It's flatter, more meadowy, the dramatic geothermal spectacle largely absent in favor of a subtler landscape. Wetland and river and lodgepole pine forest and the specific open quality of high-altitude meadows where the sky feels closer than it does at lower elevations. The Beckler River itself was lower than it gets in spring snowmelt season, but full enough to be beautiful, and the sound of it was present for most of our hike as a constant, reassuring background. We set up camp and made dinner and sat around the fire past the point where reasonable people go to bed, talking in the way that you talk when you've removed everyone from their normal contexts and put them somewhere genuinely good. Priya talked about a project she was working on, a wetland restoration assessment in the Wind River Range, and how it was making her think differently about what restoration actually means when you're dealing with ecosystems that have been altered over centuries rather than decades. Marcus talked about a disastrous date his co-worker had been on and turned the story into something extremely funny. Claire showed us photographs she had taken on the hike-in, and they were genuinely good, the kind of photographs where the person taking them clearly sees things that other people in the same location miss. Danny and I sat close to the fire and didn't talk a lot, which is one of the things I have always liked about being with him. The permission to be in a good place together without having to narrate it. I went to sleep that night feeling like we had made the right choice in every direction. Saturday morning, we had planned a longer hike to see the thermal features of the Beckler section, and then loop back along the river for the wildlife viewing that Priya had flagged as the main draw of early morning in this part of the park. We were out of camp by 7:30, which required effort, given that Marcus had not gone to sleep until past midnight, and made his feelings about the early start known in the specific theatrical way he makes his feelings about things known when he is actually fine with them and just wants it acknowledged that he is making a sacrifice. The morning was perfect. Cold enough that breath was visible in the air, the sky at altitude, that particular deep blue that it gets before the sun has fully committed to the day, the lodgepole forest on either side of the trail, dark and quiet. We saw bison at what Priya estimated was a safe viewing distance, a large solitary bull, and we all stopped and watched it for several minutes, in the way that you watch bison when you actually see one, rather than just drive past one from a car. They are much larger than photographs suggest, and they have a quality of complete indifference to your presence that is simultaneously reassuring and slightly unsettling. The meadow sections of the trail were wet with dew, and the light hitting them produced a quality that Claire photographed for about 15 minutes, while the rest of us stood and waited and did not complain, because the photographs were going to be worth it. The thermal feature area was about 4 miles from camp. The Beckler thermal features are not the rainbow-colored, dramatically steaming showpieces of the Upper Geyser Basin. They are quieter, smaller, more embedded in the landscape, pale blue-white, where the temperature is highest, and a stranger clearer blue-green, where it isn't ringed by the orange-yellow bacterial mat that forms wherever the water cools enough at the edges. The steam rising from them in the cold morning air gave the whole area a quality of something not quite in the present moment, something that predated the surrounding forest and would outlast it. Which it would. The thermal features of Yellowstone are the surface expression of a caldera that is 45 miles across and that has been geologically active for 2 million years, and standing at their edges you can feel this in a way that is hard to articulate but impossible to miss. There were warning signs at the approach to the thermal area. I want to be clear about this, and I want to be clear about my own culpability in what follows. There were multiple warning signs posted at intervals, with specific language about not approaching the thermal features beyond the designated viewing areas, not touching the water, staying on established trails, and the reasons for these requirements, which included the fact that the ground around active thermal features can be thin, crust over near boiling water, and that people have died from breaking through. The signs were legible and well-maintained and completely clear in their meaning. Marcus looked at the fence around the nearest pool and said it was ruining the view, and he wanted to see it without the fence in the frame of his pictures. This is the kind of thing that Marcus says, and the kind of thing that in the previous 3 years of knowing him, I had heard many times in many contexts, and the kind of thing that I had never before this trip successfully pushed back on, because the social cost of being the person who makes a fuss about it had always seemed higher than the cost of going along. I know this about myself, and I have been working on it. But in that moment on that Saturday morning I did not push back, and neither did Priya, and neither did Danny, and we went past the fence. We did not touch the water. We stayed on what appeared to be stable ground. We were not reckless in any physical sense, or not in any physical sense that produced immediate consequences. We were just on the wrong side of the fence taking photographs of a genuinely beautiful thermal pool in the mountains of Wyoming for about 20 minutes. I have thought about those 20 minutes many times. I have thought about whether what happened would have happened anyway, whether the fence was the relevant factor, or whether we had already done the relevant thing by entering the area at all, by sleeping in that campsite, by being in that section of the backcountry. I don't have an answer to this, and I have stopped expecting to develop one. What I noticed as we were leaving, walking back toward the main trail, was a man standing at the tree line. He was at the edge of the lodgepole forest on the north side of the meadow, maybe 40 yards from where we were on the trail. The distance was enough that I could not see his face clearly. What I could see was his posture, and his posture was the first thing that was wrong in the way that things were going to be wrong, which I did not understand at the time. He was standing completely still in a way that people do not stand completely still, not the stillness of someone pausing to observe something, not the stillness of someone catching their breath, but the complete suspended stillness of something that has been in exactly that position for a long time and has no immediate relationship to the concept of moving. He was wearing dark clothing. He was facing toward us. I said to Danny quietly enough that the others didn't hear, "Is that a ranger?" Danny looked. He said he didn't think so, that the uniform wasn't right, that rangers wore the recognizable NPS uniform. and this man was not in one. I said, "Do you think he saw us go past the fence?" Danny said he thought probably yes, and he sounded uncomfortable about it, in the way that Danny sounds uncomfortable about things, which is barely audibly and only visible if you know what you're listening for. The man at the tree line did not call out. He did not move toward us. He did not raise a hand or make any gesture of acknowledgement or challenge. He stood with that complete arrested stillness, and he watched us as we walked back to the trail and continued north, and I watched him in my peripheral vision until the terrain shifted and a rise in the meadow put him out of my sight line. After that, I told myself he was a ranger who had decided not to confront us, or a day hiker who had stopped to watch the wildlife. And I mostly believed this and mostly stopped thinking about it. By the time we reached the lunch spot Priya had identified from the maps, a granite outcrop above the river, with the view across the meadow and enough flat rock to sit comfortably. Mostly stopped thinking about it, not entirely. That evening at the fire, I told Priya what I had seen. I had been carrying it through the afternoon in the category of things I was uncertain whether to mention uncertain, because I couldn't articulate what was wrong with what I had seen in terms that would make it sound wrong rather than ordinary and uncertain, because I had a general policy of not wanting to be the person who manufactures alarm where none is warranted. But the image of the man at the tree line was still with me, in a way that images from ordinary events usually aren't, and the best way I've found to test whether something I noticed is genuinely significant, or whether it's just my own anxiety, manufacturing significance, is to say it out loud to someone I trust and see what happens. Priya listened, and then she said she had seen him too. I said you didn't say anything. She said she hadn't wanted to make it weird, which was exactly the same reason I hadn't said anything earlier, and the fact that we had both made the same calculation for the same reason, and both arrived at the same place of not saying anything, was itself, I thought, a piece of information. She said there was something wrong with his face. I said, "What do you mean?" She thought about how to say it. She is a precise person, and she takes her time with precision. She said, "You know when you're looking at a person and their face is responding to things, to light, to what they're looking at, to whatever's going through their head. And even if they're not showing much expression, there's still movement, still responsiveness." She said the man at the tree line didn't have that. She said his face was static in a way that faces aren't static even when they're not doing anything visible. I said, "Yeah, that's the thing." She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to describe it all afternoon. It's like his face was a very accurate picture of a face rather than an actual face." Does that make sense? It made complete sense, and I told her so. We heard Danny and Marcus coming back from the water filtration pump and didn't continue the conversation. But I went to sleep that night thinking about what Priya had said about the picture of a face, about the accuracy without the responsiveness, and about the man at the tree line who had stood in that arrested stillness and watched us with a face that was doing the right things without doing the things that make the right things mean anything. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to something moving near the camp. I want to be precise about this because the difference between what I heard and what I would explain it as matters for everything that came after. What I heard was not the brushing and rustling of a small animal in the underbrush, which I have heard in the back country many times, and which has a specific acoustic character, quick, irregular, low to the ground, stopping and starting. What I heard had weight. It had the weight of something that placed its steps deliberately, and it moved at a consistent pace that had pauses in it, at intervals that were too regular to be the random pauses of an animal investigating terrain. It was moving around the perimeter of the camp, not approaching the tents circling them at a distance of maybe 20 or 30 feet, with the specific quality of something that was oriented toward the camp without moving toward it. It circled twice that I could count. Then it stopped. The stopping was complete, no diminishing, no gradual withdrawal, just present and then not present. I lay still for a long time after it stopped. Danny was asleep next to me, or appeared to be asleep, and I didn't wake him because I had nothing to say that wasn't going to sound like the product of anxiety in the dark, which is a thing I have learned to be appropriately skeptical of in myself. I told myself it was a bear. Bears investigate campsites at night. Bears move around perimeters. The size and weight I had heard in the footsteps were consistent with a bear. I repeated this to myself until I could sleep, and eventually I could sleep. And in the morning the specific terror of it had faded to the background in the way that nighttime fears often fade in daylight, when everything is normal again, and there is coffee and breakfast and the sound of the river. Everything was normal again in the morning. I noted this with relief, and let the relief do the work of reassurance that it was designed to do. Sunday was supposed to be our last full day in the back country before we hiked out Monday morning. Priya had planned a shorter loop, 4 miles or so along the river and back, good for wildlife in the early morning light, low effort, after the previous day's longer distance. We were out of camp by 7, the sun barely up the meadows, still in the deep blue-gray light of early morning at altitude. The river trail was beautiful in a way that felt personal, which is the best quality that a trail can have. The Bekler River in late August is lower than it runs in spring, but still full enough to make the constant sound that moving water makes, and the light through the trees was doing things with shadows and the early horizontal sun that I understand why painters come to the mountains to see. We were all in a good mood in the easy way of people who are on their last full day of something good and can feel its value without the melancholy that comes later. Marcus was talking about something in one of his stories, and the story was funny, and we were all in the right state to find it funny. I was walking at the back of the group, my habitual position far enough behind to have my own experience of the terrain while close enough to be part of the conversation if I wanted to be. Danny was immediately ahead of me. Priya was at the front with Claire beside her. Marcus was between Danny and Priya, turned halfway around to tell his story to the maximum possible audience. About 2 miles from camp, the trail passed through a section where the lodgepole forest came close on both sides, and the canopy thickened enough to change the light quality, dimming it and greening it in the way of old-growth sections, where there is enough layering overhead to filter what gets through. It was beautiful in the specific way of places that are not oriented toward you. Beauty that doesn't invite or acknowledge, that is simply the condition of the place, rather than a quality directed at anyone standing in it. I was looking at the trees and the light when I saw the woman standing in the forest on my left. She was maybe 25 feet off the trail in the space between the nearest trees. She was standing with the same complete arrested stillness as the man at the tree line the previous day, the same quality of something that had been in that position for a long time without moving. She was wearing a red jacket that was damaged in a way I noticed immediately, and that I have thought about many times since. Not the damage of one hard day outdoors, not torn or soiled in the way of a single difficult event, but the accumulated damage of extended outdoor exposure, the fading and fraying and general deterioration that represents weeks rather than hours. Her hair was loose and tangled. Her face, when she turned toward me as I stopped on the trail, was the thing that rooted me in place. Her face was assembled correctly. Every feature was where faces have features proportioned, the way faces are proportioned, the overall impression in a quick glance entirely human. But a quick glance was not what I was giving it. I was stopped on the trail with the others moving ahead of me, and I was looking at her face with the specific attention you give to something when you already know something is wrong, but you haven't identified what it is yet. And what I found when I looked was this: her face was not responding. Not to the light, not to my presence, not to whatever internal state would normally cause the subtle, constant micro-movement that faces make even when their owners are trying to be still. It was like looking at a very accurate sculpture of a face or at a very accurate photograph, all the right information and none of the animation that makes faces mean something rather than just represent something. Her eyes were tracking me. This was the specific dissonance of it. The tracking was present. Her gaze moved as I moved. She was registering where I was. But behind the tracking there was nothing that tracking eyes usually have behind them. No assessment, no recognition, no curiosity. The mechanical registration of location without the processing that location is supposed to mean. I said, "Are you okay?" The pause before she answered was 3 or 4 seconds. Not the pause of someone who didn't hear me or who is thinking about their answer. Something longer and more complete, like the gap where a response should form and hasn't yet. She said yes, just the word. No inflection that matched it. No following question or comment or the instinctive reciprocal check that people offer when a stranger asks them a concerned question. Just yes, flat and single, in a voice that had the acoustic quality of something coming from slightly further away than her position in the trees should produce. I said, "Are you lost? Do you need help?" The same pause. "Then I'm looking for the trail." I said the trail was right here, that I could show her. I took a step toward her. She took 2 steps back. Not the step back of a person who is startled or who wants space in the way that people sometimes want space. She stepped back further into the trees in the opposite direction from the trail she had said she was looking for, and the movement was wrong in a way that I could not fully name at the time, but that I can name now, 17 months later, having turned it over enough times to understand it. It was too smooth. The movement had no preparation, no weight shift, no micro-adjustment that human movement has before it becomes movement. It was as if the decision to move and the moving were simultaneous, rather than sequential. She stopped when I stopped following. We looked at each other across the distance she had created. Her jacket had a logo over the left chest pocket. I couldn't read the text from where I was standing. The distance was too much, and the jacket too faded, but I could see the shape of the logo, and something about it was familiar in the way that things are familiar when you've seen them somewhere and can't quite locate where. The kind of familiar that sits in the back of the mind and produces unease rather than recognition. She said you should go. It gets harder once you've been here longer. I said, what gets harder? She didn't answer. She turned and walked into the trees, and the forest took her in 4 or 5 steps in a way that should not have been possible given how fast she moved. Because she was not moving fast. She was moving at a walking pace. I could see each step, but the trees seemed to receive her faster than the walking pace should have produced, and then she was simply not where she had been. I caught up with the others quickly, and I told them immediately. I did not do what I had done the night before with the sounds around the camp, did not file it under anxiety or misperception or the product of an overactive mind in a somewhat strange situation. I told them right there on the trail because I needed the information to be outside my head and shared, and I needed to see how it sounded when it was words rather than experience. Marcus said she was probably just a day hiker who didn't want to talk. He said this in the tone of a person suggesting the simplest available explanation, which is Marcus's first response to most things, and which is usually right and on this occasion was not. Claire agreed with Marcus. Danny listened to my description of her voice and her movement and her face and the pause before she answered and the way the trees took her, and he did not offer an explanation. Priya said, "Describe her jacket." I described it. She said the logo on the pocket. What shape was it? I described the shape as best I could. Priya was quiet for a moment and then said, "I read something before the trip. A forum discussion about disappearances in the Bekler area. I want you to listen to what I'm about to say before you tell me I'm being paranoid." Marcus said, "Priya." She said, "Marcus, please." He went quiet. She said she had found the thread during the research phase of trip planning when she was reading everything available about the Bekler section of the park. It was posted by someone who identified themselves as a former seasonal ranger, a person who had worked in the Bekler area for 12 years before leaving the Park Service, and who had posted about a pattern they had observed and documented across multiple disappearances in the area. The pattern involved sightings by other hikers in the days surrounding a disappearance of people who were wrong in ways that were difficult to describe but consistent. Wrong faces, wrong movement, wrong voices, standing in places that didn't make sense in ways that didn't make sense. She said she had read it and decided it was the kind of thing you find when you search any national park's name alongside the word disappearances, which is the kind of thing that exists in abundance and that is mostly not worth taking seriously. She said she was taking it seriously now. Danny said, "How long ago was it posted?" She checked her phone. She said about 14 months ago. Danny said, "Did people respond to it?" She said, "Yes, many people." She said she was going to read us the original post when we got back to camp, and she wanted us to actually listen to it. We walked back to camp in a different quality of silence than we had walked out in. When we got back to camp, there was something wrong with the cooler. It was in the same general area where we had left it between the two trees with the bear straps intact. But it had been moved, not dramatically 2 or 3 feet roughly from where it had been sitting, but the evidence was clear. The ring of compressed pine needles and disturbed duff marking where the cooler had sat for 36 hours was visible and did not align with where the cooler currently sat. Between the two positions on the soft ground, there were marks that might have been from dragging or from multiple footsteps in close proximity. The marks were not the wide, five-toed, claw-extended marks of a bear track. They were narrower. They had a different distribution. Danny crouched next to the marks for a long time and said nothing. Marcus opened the cooler. Everything was intact. Nothing was taken. Nothing disturbed, all of it, exactly as we had packed it that morning. I said a bear that gets to a cooler gets into the cooler. Danny said, yeah. I said a bear doesn't pick up a cooler and move it and put it down. Marcus said maybe it just nosed it over while it was investigating, and then got spooked. Danny said, still crouching, still looking at the marks. These aren't from a bear. Marcus looked at Danny for a moment and then looked away and didn't say anything else about bears. I told them about the sounds from the previous night. The weight and the pacing and the circling and the way it stopped all at once rather than fading. Danny looked at me and said he had been awake too and had heard the same thing and had made the same decision I had made about not saying anything. And I could see in his face the same recognition I was feeling, which was that we had both been doing the thing people do when they don't want to be the person who makes a situation into something serious, and that we had both done it one occasion too many. Priya said, read the forum post or not read it. We sat around the cold fire pit while the late afternoon light moved across the meadow, and Priya read us the forum post. The former ranger described 12 years in the Beclair section. They described a rate of disappearances in the area that they believed the park's official statistics did not accurately reflect for reasons having to do with the way cases were classified and cross-referenced individuals recorded as having left the park, voluntarily cases transferred to county jurisdiction, without return communication hikers who were listed as missing, but whose cases were closed without resolution and without recovery. They described 3 personal involvements in searches for missing hikers in the Beclair that had found no trace of the missing individuals, despite being launched within 24 hours of last confirmed sightings and involving substantial resources. And then they described the sightings. Across their 12 years and across the responses to the post from other hikers and former seasonal staff, a pattern in the days surrounding a disappearance, other people in the area reported seeing someone who was wrong, standing still in the arrested way, moving with a quality described variously as too smooth, too deliberate, not right. Faces that were not responding, voices with the wrong acoustic quality, the sound of someone further away than they were. The consistency across unconnected accounts from different years was the thing the former ranger said they found most compelling and most difficult to explain. Toward the end of the post, the former ranger wrote, I want to be explicit that I am not offering a theory about what these sightings represent. I have worked in wilderness search and rescue for a substantial part of my career, and I am not given to supernatural explanations. What I am saying is that the pattern is there, and that it is consistent, and that I believe it merits documentation regardless of whether we currently have a framework for explaining it. What I am also saying as someone who spent 12 years in the Beckler and who has thought about this more than I would like to have had occasion to think about it, is that the individuals who were later reported missing were in almost every documented case, not the ones who saw the wrong things. The ones who saw them were the ones who were with the missing individuals when they disappeared. They are the ones who survived to report what they saw. The last line of the post said, "If you see something in the Beckler that looks like a person but does not feel like a person, leave. Do not approach it. Do not try to communicate with it. Get back to the trailhead while the trail is still clearly the trail, because one of the things multiple witnesses have described is a quality the terrain acquires after a certain point of exposure that makes familiar paths seem unfamiliar. Leave before that happens. I am serious about this." Priya lowered her phone. The meadow was going to gold in the late afternoon light, the mountains visible above the tree line in the distance, an elk at the far edge of the meadow, moving slowly toward the tree line. Nobody said anything for about 2 full minutes. Then Marcus said, "Okay. I think we should pack up tonight and hike out first thing tomorrow as early as we can get moving." Nobody argued with this. We packed what we could that evening and set alarms for 4:30, and I want to tell you the night was uneventful, but I don't think that would be accurate. The sounds came again around midnight, the same weight, the same deliberate pace, the same circling pattern. This time all 5 of us were awake for it. I could hear the quality of breathing from the other tent that told me Marcus and Claire were awake, and Danny was rigid beside me in the way that he holds himself when he is not sleeping, but is very still. The circling went on longer than it had the night before, or it felt like it went on longer, and I have thought about which of those is more accurate and have decided they might be the same thing. Then a voice, very close to the tent, close enough that the tent wall was between us and the source by only a few feet, close enough that if the voice had been a human voice at that proximity, it would have been entirely clear and audible. But it wasn't entirely clear and audible. It was the same phenomenon I had noticed with the woman on the trail, the acoustic quality of something further away than it was the words at the edge of comprehensibility, the cadence of speech, without the content of speech, landing clearly. I could hear the structure of what was being said without being able to extract the meaning from it. Danny's hand found mine in the dark of the tent. It stopped. A pause of perhaps a minute. Then the footsteps again moving away in a direction I could not determine. Gone. Danny unzipped his sleeping bag. I said, "Please don't." He said he needed to see. I held his arm and said, "Please," and he stopped and stayed. And I think about that regularly now, the simple fact of him staying, and I am grateful for it in a way that I don't have clean language for. In the morning, Danny went outside first before any of us, and he came back in and he said there were footprints. He said they came from the north side of the camp, and they approached the tent and they stopped right at the tent door. He said they just stopped in the middle of the site without returning in any direction he could track. He said he spent 10 minutes looking for the continuation of the tracks and did not find it. He said this very calmly and with the quality of someone who is determined to remain functional, and I said, "Okay." And we got up and finished packing. We were on the trail by 5:15, still dark headlamps on. The air was cold in a way that made the going feel purposeful, which helped. Nobody was talking much. Marcus, who had complained about the 7:30 start the previous day, did not complain about the 5:15 start today. The 6 miles should have taken us between 2.5 and 3 hours at our pace. We kept a faster pace than that, and it felt in a way that I noted and filed carefully, like it was taking longer than it should. The trail that had been clear and straightforward hiking in felt subtler. Hiking out, not different, not rerouted, but subtler, as though the distinguishing features that make a trail were slightly less distinct than they had been. I had the same sensation twice of being unsure whether the path we were following was the marked trail or a game trail that ran parallel to it, and both times I checked the map and the compass and confirmed we were where we were supposed to be, and both times the confirmation was less reassuring than it should have been. I mentioned this to Priya quietly enough that the others couldn't hear, and she said she had noticed it too and had been watching the trail markers more closely than she usually would. She said it was like the trails were slightly less willing to be obvious than they had been. She said this in her precise way, and it was the most precise description of the sensation that I've heard. About 2 miles from the trailhead, in a section where the forest thinned and there was an open area to the east of the trail, Danny stopped. I almost walked into him. I said what, and he said very quietly and without any drama, "Don't react. Keep moving at the same pace. Look at the tree line to your right." I looked. In the trees, perhaps 40 feet from the trail, there was a man, standing with the complete arrested stillness, wearing a blue jacket. At the distance and in the morning light of the lodgepole forest, I could not see his face clearly. Marcus was walking immediately ahead of Danny, talking to Claire. He was wearing a blue jacket. He had been wearing it the entire trip. The man in the trees was built like Marcus. He was the same height as Marcus. The jacket was the same shade of blue. I kept walking. Danny kept walking. I did not look at Marcus because I was afraid of what my face would do if I looked at Marcus, with the man in the trees in my peripheral vision, and I was afraid of what that would produce in the group, and I was doing the calculation of what we could afford to know versus what we needed to get to the trailhead first. 2 miles. We were 2 miles from the trailhead. I looked back once. The man in the trees had not moved. His face, as the increasing distance and the shifting angles of the morning light briefly made it more visible rather than less, was doing the thing I had seen the woman's face doing on the trail. The features were all correct. Nothing behind them was. Then, as I watched, his face changed. Not all at once, gradually, feature by feature, the way a sustained expression relaxes when the concentration required to hold it is withdrawn. The organization that had made it resemble Marcus's face became less organized. The underlying structure that the organization had been placed over became more visible. Whatever was underneath the attempt to be Marcus's face was not something I was able to look at for more than about 2 seconds before I turned away and focused on the trail and kept walking. We did not stop for the remaining 2 miles. We did not run because I had read enough about what happens to people who run in the wrong situations to know that running can invite pursuit, and I did not want to invite pursuit from anything in those trees. We walked at the fastest pace I could maintain without breaking into a run, and nobody argued. And when the trailhead and the parking area appeared ahead of us through the trees, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized was held. Our car was where we had left it. The other vehicles were gone. The Forest Service truck was still there. We got in the car. Danny drove. We did not stop until we were 30 miles from the park entrance. Nobody said anything for a long time. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have too much to say and no framework for saying it, sitting with the highway moving under them and the park behind them, and the thing they saw in the trees, in whatever space in the mind. Recent experiences go before they've been fully processed. Marcus was the one who broke it. He said without any of his usual comic framing, that man in the trees. He was wearing my jacket. Nobody said anything. He said, and the same thing happened to Jordan. With the woman. The jacket. Priya said yes. He said so whatever they are, they use something from the people who went missing. To look like them. Or to look like someone near the people they're watching. Danny said we need to stop somewhere. I need to not be driving while I'm thinking about this. We stopped at a gas station outside of Cody, and everyone got out and stretched and stood in the parking lot in the morning light, which was bright and ordinary, and entirely indifferent to anything that had happened in the Beckler. I called my sister Becca from the far end of the parking lot because I needed to say it out loud to someone who was not standing in that parking lot with me. Becca is the person I call when I need to be believed before I've established whether what I'm saying deserves belief, and she is reliable at this in a way that I have been grateful for most of my life, and have been especially grateful for in the 17 months since August. I told her everything, sequentially as accurately as I could, including the things that sounded most unreasonable, because leaving them out would have meant telling a version that didn't match what had actually happened. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which is one of her strengths. When I finished, she said, "Are you all okay right now?" Like right now, this moment. I said yes. She said, "And Danny's okay." I said yes. She said, "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you what I think you need to do, and I need you to actually do it and not just say you will and then not." She walked me through it. File a report with the Park Service, which we did later that week, all 5 of us individually with the ranger at the Beckler Trailhead Station. Go online and find the forum thread Priya had read and add what you saw to the documented record, which I did. See someone to talk to, which is how I came to be seeing Dr. Watkins on Tuesday afternoons. Don't go back to the Beckler alone, or ideally at all. I said the woman I talked to on the trail. She was wearing the jacket of one of the missing hikers. which means she's been out there for 3 years, or whatever she is has been out there for 3 years wearing the jacket. And she warned me. She used whatever she has left to say, "Go, it gets harder," and I don't know if that was Sarah Okonkwo warning me, or something else using Sarah Okonkwo's remaining pieces to communicate, and I don't know which of those is less terrible. Becca was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Jordan, I think that question is too big for a gas station parking lot outside of Cody. I think you get home first, and then you have the big questions." She was right about that. We filed the reports. It was a confusing process because we were not reporting missing persons. We were reporting that we had seen individuals matching descriptions of missing persons who had not wanted help and had moved in ways inconsistent with lost or injured hikers, and that we had seen something in the trees that appeared to be impersonating a member of our group. The ranger who took our reports was professional and took extensive notes. A follow-up email 3 weeks later said the area had been searched and no individuals matching our descriptions had been located. I found Sarah Okonkwo's case online within an hour of getting home. She had been hiking the Beckler Meadows Trail alone in September, 3 years earlier. Last seen at the trailhead by 2 other hikers who had exchanged brief pleasantries with her. 60-plus searcher effort over 12 days, 2 helicopters, no trace recovered. Case officially open. In her most recent photographs, she was wearing a red jacket with the same logo I had seen on the woman in the trees, the same logo I had not been able to read clearly, but that I now recognized immediately and completely. I went to the forum thread Priya had found, and I read the full post and all the responses, and I added my own. I kept it factual. I described what we had seen without embellishment and without theory. Within 10 days, I had 14 private messages from other hikers and former park visitors who had been in the Beckler at various times and had seen things consistent with what I described. A couple who had turned back after one night because of what the woman described as a pervasive and sourceless feeling of being observed. A solo hiker who had seen a man standing in the trees in the arrested stillness on 3 separate occasions over 2 days before his hiking partner had walked off the trail on the second evening and not come back. A former seasonal employee who said they had asked about the disappearances during their time at the park and had been told the official figure and had known the official figure was not the real figure and had not known what to do with that knowledge. The pattern is there. It has been there for a long time. The park is beautiful, and the park is real, and the disappearances are real, and the thing in the trees with the wrong face is real, and these things coexist in a way that I have spent 17 months trying to develop an adequate relationship with. If you are planning to hike the Beckler River area of Yellowstone National Park, I am not going to tell you not to go. It is genuinely one of the most beautiful places I have been. The morning light on the meadow and the sound of the river and the bison at a distance, these things are exactly what they appear to be, and they are worth experiencing. I am going to tell you to stay on the trail. I am going to tell you to keep everyone in your group visible to each other at all times, and to know specifically what each person in your group is wearing, because if you see someone in the trees in the same jacket as the person walking in front of you, You need to know immediately which one is which, and you need to not pause to figure it out. I am going to tell you that if the trail begins to feel subtler than it should, if the markers become harder to distinguish than they were on the way in, turn around. Do not try to find the markers. Turn around and get back to the trailhead while you can still do it. And I am going to tell you that if you see someone standing very still at the tree line, someone whose face is assembled correctly, but is not responding, someone who speaks with the quality of a voice coming from further away than they are, do what she told me to do. Go. Don't look back more than once. It gets harder once you've been there longer. I believe her. I believe that completely and without reservation, and I have believed it every day for the past 17 months, and I am grateful in a way that I cannot fully articulate that I left when I did, and that whatever was in those trees decided for whatever reason that I was not what it was looking for. I think about Sarah Okonkwo. I think about what it means for something to remain in a person after they have been taken, and whether the remaining is comfort or its own kind of horror, and whether the thing that warned me was her or only using the pieces of her that were left. I don't have an answer. I don't expect to develop one. I just know what she said, and I know she said it to help me, or something in her said it to help me, and that I listened and that I got out. Get out while you still know the way.